Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by the good people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
One of the things that's strange for me as an economist is that when I say something typically about numbers, and I'll typically be talking about something like what people earned in the past or what things cost in the past or might cost in the future, these sorts of things, invariably, a non-economist will say to me, well, did you adjust for inflation? Which is so strange to me. That's what you learn as a principles level freshman economics major, that yes, you have to adjust for inflation.
That's why they're asking. That's the one thing they learned.
Maybe so, but I mean, it's so strange. It's like somebody going to Canada and coming back to this country and reporting that gas costs $5 a gallon. And then the person saying, well, yeah, but did you convert to US dollars? It's that level of basic. But nonetheless, I have a friend and listener, Dan Ott, who pokes me about this from time to time, and he sent me this link to an article in which, believe it or not, the government failed to adjust for inflation. This story evolves over the course of a month, but last month, early December, new FAFSA numbers came out. This is the form that students fill out for financial aid. And on this form, you do these calculations and it figures out how much financial aid your family is eligible for. Well, the people who put together this year's form never updated to account for the inflation that went on in 2022 leading up to 2023, right? The highest level of inflation we have endured since the 1980s. And somehow the people at FAFSA overlooked it. They never made the adjustment. As of 2 days ago, someone at FAFSA has caught this and they've changed the numbers. So now they've updated for inflation. But the bottom line is, and I don't know how many people are involved or how much each family gets on average, but I can tell you the total number. In total, it means that FAFSA is going to be handing out an extra $1.8 billion. That's the adjustment that was necessary to account for inflation. It's not like this is something that is foreign to the government. All sorts of things, Social Security payments, government pensions, the definition of the poverty line. Some states have their minimum wages tied to inflation. All these things get adjusted every year for inflation, as a matter of course.
I wonder what they'll do next.
Yeah, I have no idea. I have no idea what's going on here.
Stay tuned and we'll find out. I've been paying a little bit of attention lately, Ant, to the news media, and I guess I kind of took an interest when Sports Illustrated laid off damn near everybody who works for Sports Illustrated.
They laid off everybody, didn't they?
Yeah. As a subscriber to Sports Illustrated, I'm looking forward to that next
issue.
Thank you. Boy, that one went right into the dead zone for me. You know, and the jokes kind of write themselves, right? They've been going woke for a while, and, you know, with the trans people in the swimsuit issues and fat people in the swimsuit issues. And I don't really want to get into it, but let's just say that they've been working astride their core audience. And something that, you know, if you picked up a copy of Sports Illustrated lately, and I hadn't for a while, and I've just started getting it in the mail, it's about a third as big as it once was. It's almost nothing.
This was a big magazine back in the day.
It was back when there were things like big magazines. And I came across a Politico article today. Listen to this. The LA Times has laid off 20% of its newsroom. Time magazine laid off 15% of their unionized editorial employees. Sports Illustrated, of course, is mentioned. Business Insider got rid of 8% of its staff. There seems to be no end in sight here.
Well, this is something that you and I have felt directly. We wrote separately for newspapers, but then we started writing together maybe 10, 15 years ago for newspapers all throughout the country. I think of the, 400 articles that we've written together, I think maybe 30 of them we got paid for. The other 370 were free. Because why? There's so many people, and I don't mean just, any old person off the street, but they're experts in various topics. So many of them who are willing to write that the newspapers can get away with not paying anything.
Yeah, and it gets worse, right? Because Facebook was driving much, if not most, of the online traffic to a number of online outlets. And now Facebook is getting out of the news business entirely, throwing its hands up, right? Everybody complains about it. The Canadian government won't allow Canadians to share links on Facebook for news stories.
You're kidding me. Why?
Some idiotic reason that only Canadians can understand. Look, this is going to have far-reaching ramifications in the news business. You know, we're coming into an election year and everybody's all exercised because they want better news coverage. Well, if they wanted better news coverage, they would get better news coverage. I'm just saying. Nonetheless, people complain about the coverage they're getting. I complain about the coverage I'm getting. But what the hell did you expect? I mean, these companies can't make any money. That means they can't exist. And that's just how it is. And they're going to keep cutting back until they become profitable. And if that means cutting back right to the point where they're out of business entirely, well, that's what they're going to do.
But I think it gets even worse with the advent of AI, because AI now, not only can it write the articles, it can illustrate them. So basically, you need one guy who says, give me articles on the following things.
And AI cannot write the articles.
Well, they can. Now, they may not be accurate, but they can certainly write.
They're not good. They're not accurate. They're just a bunch of words strung together. And only an economist would say that that's a good article. Come on. No, that's not how this works. You have to actually know what you're talking about.
Yeah, but see, here's the thing. How many quote unquote experts have we read in the popular press who don't know what they're talking about? I think this is a matter of the readership not being able to distinguish.
Now, the readership, by definition, doesn't know, or they wouldn't be reading. Right? That's why they're reading, to learn something. Now, you can make the case, and I think it's reasonable to do so, that people who write for newspapers and magazines aren't the greatest, and they haven't been for a long time. My guess is that they never actually were, but they could at least do a good job if they wanted to. AI, on the other hand, cannot, not as presently construed. So, you know, that is not the answer in 2024. I don't know what the answer is in 2025 or 2028 or whatever, but it's certainly not the answer right now. That doesn't mean there is an answer. I think there probably isn't one. And people chafe at that sort of thing, right? When you say, well, this is what's happening, it's bad, there's no answer. Well, there's often no answer, and I have reason to believe that this is going to be one of those times. We're just going to suffer with a diminishing news media that gets worse every year until it becomes pointless to listen to read, to watch. And I think we're close.
But let's go back to your original point, which is that you get what you pay for. And if people aren't willing to pay for high quality news, they're not going to get it. You can't expect to get something that is costly on an ongoing basis for nothing.
That's right. And when we look at where we are and how we got here, it's actually pretty easy to see, right? Many of us were paying the piper in the form of newspaper subscriptions for not only years, but decades, generations, right? The web comes along. You could read stuff online for free. Before you know it, you're thinking, why am I paying for this newspaper? You stop paying for the newspaper. Newspapers start to disappear. Then you get angry because newspapers have disappeared. Well, what did you expect was going to happen? I think it's become pretty clear that you cannot monetize online news. People have tried. Maybe the New York Times and the LA Times can get away with it, but very few other outfits can. You know, we're going to have to figure out what all this looks like moving forward, and I don't think we have the first clue. Anyway, that brings us, of course, Ant, to the foolishness of the week. You might recall, and some of our listeners might recall, look, we don't talk often about international things, right? We don't want to take a chunk out of international actors. We don't have any skin in that game. We don't typically understand international politics nearly as well as we understand what's going on in the United States. But some time back, when Hamas lowered the boom on Israel, we said, well, Hamas absolutely knows the response that this will engender.
Right.
It will yield a disproportionate response from Israel, the likes of which it has never seen before. And the only conclusion at that time was, well, that's clearly the response it wants for whatever its reasons, right? Does that mean a number, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are going to end up dead in the bargain? Yes, that's exactly what it means. And you have to ask yourself, why on earth would Hamas want that? People said some horrible things to me after I said this once upon a time. I'll just say, I got some pushback on this. And that's all well and good, and you say and push back any way you want. Now, fast forward. The Israelis have been saying that the United Nations is an anti-Israel organization. And people have been saying, no, that's crazy. That's conspiratorial thinking. Well, what did we find out yesterday? We found out that the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA is how it's typically referred, come to find out at least a dozen of their employees, and I want to say that they've got thousands of employees. So 12 might not be a whole lot by percentages, but at least a dozen of their employees took part in the raid on Israel.
Oh, they were taking up arms.
That's correct.
Wow, that's astounding.
So tell me how Israel's wrong. And you can say, look, a few bad apples, and that's all well and good. But unless you make the few bad apples argument all the time, say, for example, with American police officers, if you're not willing to accept it there, you can't accept it here either. You can make the case, I think, that, look, it's a very small percentage, but here we have United Nations employees taking up arms against the country that has claimed for decades that the United Nations works against its interests at every turn. How are we going to tell the Israelis that they're mistaken now?
If you're going to run with the bad apple argument, my question is, are they still UN employees?
No, to the UN's eternal credit, they were all fired.
Okay, all right.
Their contracts were all terminated. But this is an organization, this arm of the UN, that the United States, in the form of tax dollars, has given them nearly $1 billion since Joe Biden took office. $1 billion American dollars went to that very group. Does that seem right? Look, and again, I can diagnose the problem, but I see absolutely no clear answer. I know what the answer to this nonsense is. Donald Trump, during his presidency, had seized funding to this group. Is that the right thing to do? Hell if I know. There are problems, and problems require money. Well, here we are, and you can bet that we're going to have more carnage rather than less because of this. And again, that's what Hamas wanted. Why? Why is this what Hamas wanted? So I would advise anybody who's up in arms, and there are a lot of people out there who I think justifiably are, think through that question, because that is the right question.
Do you have a hypothesis?
I do, but not for today. We'll get to it some other day. I don't want to take attention away from this, because this is especially repugnant.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
What we're talking about today is our drift northward into yet further uncharted territory with the national debt. We did just pass 34 trillion not too long ago. It occurred to me yesterday that if we decide to do one of these episodes every time we pass a round number, pretty soon we're going to have to do one of these episodes every week.
That's right, I know. It was 34 trillion, just I guess it was last week. I saw that, and it occurred to me, our book, which is not old, our book came out 3 years ago. That's nothing in the lifespan of books. In our book, we quote the national debt, and at the time it was 23 trillion.
No, that's not right. That can't be right.
It's 50% more today than it was 3 years ago.
Can that be right?
Yeah.
God, I got to go look at our book again.
I looked at it and I thought, oh my God, someone's going to look at this and think that the book's 20 years old.
It was 31 trillion, wasn't it?
I don't think so. I'm almost positive it was 23. But I have to say that, we're writing the book in 2020, which means we're using 2019 data. Let me look up the number here.
The people at home can hear you clicking away.
I have to know what it is.
It would take me less time to go grab the copy of the book.
Well, you could look at the book. I'm looking up to see what the actual number was in 2023. And of course, now that I want it on the spur of the moment, I'm not going to find it. Federal debt. And by the way, anybody who's interested in looking up numbers, a really nice place to go is FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database. They've got tons of stuff here. You just type in FRED and whatever it is you're looking for, and you'll find it much more easily than what I have found this, because I typed in the wrong thing.
The more I think about it, 24 trillion is probably right, because we added 6 trillion in the COVID period.
It is.
Right?
Yeah, I'm looking at it. Q1 of 2020, it was 23 trillion.
That does actually make sense now that I've had a moment to think about it. Well, it just keeps skyrocketing. And you used to say, oh, it won't be long, James, before $1 trillion deficits are the new normal. Well, yep, that's happened.
Oh, yeah,
we're there.
They became the new normal a couple of years ago, right about the same time that the debt went up by 50%.
And people say, well, that's a one-time thing with COVID. I'll just point out, it's always a one-time thing with something, but if it were truly ever a one-time thing, it would start going down. And it hasn't gone down since the late 1950s.
Yeah, it hasn't gone down since then. And these one-time things that you're referring to, they seem to occur every 10 years.
Well, they seem to occur every 10 years, but other one-time things seem to happen every year.
Yeah, and I'm thinking here of the COVID lockdowns. Big thing, big addition to the deficit, to the debt there. That's in 2020. Roughly 10 years earlier, it was the housing crisis. And again, we had the same thing, the federal government taking on massive debt to bail out banks and so forth. 10 years before that, 9/11. Actually, 1990s was good news. Clinton was in office, and he came closer than any modern president to balancing the budget. So things were actually going well then. But you're absolutely right. Politicians will say, well, this is just a one-time thing, except it's an entire sequence of one-time things over and over again.
We used to say back when it was, quote unquote, only in the 20s of trillions, that the numbers are so big that we need an analogy to explain the size, and then we need an analogy to explain the analogy.
Yeah.
Because even that's too big. Well, trust me, if that was true then, it's much, much more true now.
What we didn't say in the book, I wish we had, is that if you go back through time, it seems to be the case that the federal debt doubles about every 8 to 9 years. That's horrific. If you know anything about exponential growth, you get something that doubles on a regular basis. Before long, the thing becomes virtually infinite.
Well, that's right. You've just described cancer.
Right, yes. And I was looking through the CBO, Congressional Budget Office reports the other day. They give projections going out 10 years into the future. And in their projections, every single deficit is over $1 trillion. In fact, some of them, I think they start to come close to 2 trillion or maybe even cross 2 trillion.
And we're here to tell you these things are underestimated.
They're underestimated. And if you take their 10-year out forecast, which I don't have it in front of me, but I believe it's something like $50 to $70 trillion debt 10 years into the future. If you adjust it for CBO's historical bias, we'll actually be looking at over $100 trillion, over $100 trillion in debt within the next 10 years.
I wonder if anybody will take it seriously then.
Well, something interesting starts to happen, if you want to use the word interesting. Even at interest rates that were current prior to the Fed tightening interest rates recently.
So functionally 0%.
Yeah, functionally zero. The federal government was paying like 2.5% interest on its debt. At those interest rates, you get up to $100 trillion in debt. And all of a sudden, the annual interest expense is eating anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of your tax revenues.
And what does it look like if your interest rates are more like they are right now.
Yeah, if your interest rates are more like they are now, all of a sudden...
Triple that.
Yeah, all of a sudden, you're taking half or more, 3/4 of your tax revenue is going solely to paying interest on the debt.
I've said this before, and everybody waves their hands and says, oh, you don't understand. I think I do, and I'm going to say it again. There will come a time at current rates where the entire tax revenue of the United States goes to paying the interest on the debt.
Yeah.
And the day that happens, that's a tipping point that you can't come back from.
Yes, and this is the thing. When we've talked about the debt before, people have come back at us and said, well, really, you don't need to worry about the debt because the government doesn't have to pay it off. It's not like you or me, we have finite life and we've got to pay off our debts before we die, if not our children do. But they say, and this is correct, that the government doesn't have to pay off its debt. It can just keep rolling it over. Now, while that's correct, it's also true that if you don't pay it off, you've got to continually pay interest. And that's the thing we're talking about now. Now, when interest was 5%, 10% of federal tax revenues, nobody cared very much. But when it gets to be 50% or more of federal revenues, now we've got a major problem because you can't pay for stuff you need to pay for because so much of your tax revenue is going to pay for interest on stuff you bought decades ago.
And when that happens, people will say, well, just don't pay it. Because you know why, Ant? They're all convinced when they say that, what they think they're saying is, the Chinese.
Yeah, and the Chinese have been cutting back on how much they loan the federal government. We owe the Chinese, I think, around $1 trillion.
Because the Chinese aren't crazy. They're not going to keep walking down that road.
Yeah, the bulk of the money we owe to Social Security Trust Fund. So I think that's in the neighborhood of like $6 or $7 trillion. You want to say, okay, don't pay it back. Well, that's money that's going to retirees. It's not like, there's this pot of money somewhere that the federal government can dole out or not dole out as it chooses. This is money that it owes retirees.
What will we do? Will we just tell grandma and grandpa that they can't have food next month?
Yeah, and someone's going to say, well, the key to that problem is you need to remove the Social Security cap and tax the rich more and all of this. I'm sorry, but the rich don't have enough money to come up with what we're looking for here.
No one does. And if you look at it, well, okay, if we owe them $8 trillion, where's the other $25 trillion?
Yeah, where's that coming from?
We owe a lot of money to a lot of people, apparently.
We've said before, I'd love repeating it because it blows people's minds, that if we confiscated everything that the top 1% own, forget about raising taxes on them, just take everything they own, you're only going to raise around $3 trillion, maybe $4 trillion if you're lucky.
Barely enough to balance 1 year's budget at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
And look, seeing as how we're saying things again that blow people's minds, let's say if you took all of the money we spent on all of the defense programs in the entire country and got rid of the military, right? Literally everything down to zero. Wouldn't balance the budget by a long shot.
The annual budget for the Department of Defense is around $750 billion. So you don't even get to a full trillion by cutting the entire Department of Defense. Now, some people, actually some libertarians, have come back at me saying, no, the Department of Defense budget is actually much more than that. They're quoting numbers like to the 1 to 2 trillion range. And I dug into that because I thought it was a strange thing to say. And what they're counting is pension payments, basically the equivalent of Social Security, but for retirees of the military. Now, you really shouldn't count that. When we talk about shutting down the military, we mean the military, not cutting off what is in effect retirement payments. So really, you're talking, $750 billion. That's what you get. And if you don't pay the Chinese, you get another roughly $750 billion. So that's $1.5 trillion that we've saved right there out of 34 that we owe.
Guess what's not going to work?
Yeah.
I mean, look, you're being a little snarky because, well, we would actually presumably be able to save at least the military amount moving forward every year, right up until we needed a military.
Right.
We could only save, I think, the Chinese amount once, and then, probably from that point forward, the Chinese would be wholly unwilling to invest in anything American, which would bring with it ripple effects that would kill you.
Yeah, well, more than that, if you don't pay the Chinese, you're going to need that military.
That might be correct. And, if you don't pay the Chinese, you're going to have to explain to every other country who invested in you on the face of the planet why they're different than the Chinese.
Yeah, that's right.
Good luck with that.
And so where we're left here, and before I ever met you, I was saying this, and after I met you, we were both saying it, and this has been going on for 20 years now.
I want to stop you right there because it's my firm belief that before you met me, you did not say anything smart.
Let's just say fewer people listen to me.
That might be right, but I'm going to stick with my assertion. Anyway, go ahead.
We said, look, the end game here is the Federal Reserve ends up printing money. It finances the federal spending, the federal borrowing.
Why, Ant? Because it's the only answer left.
It's the only answer. That's right. There's nothing else to be done here. And when that happens, you get inflation. And I had said expect 5 to 10% on an ongoing basis. So when 2% used to be the normal, expect 5 to 10% to be the normal. And lo and behold, that's kind of what's been happening.
Well, it's about where we've landed for now. When you dig into the data, it looks like we're going to back off from that for a while. And then we'll see. But here's the thing. To the extent that the government raises taxes to cover our shortfall, well, there are a lot of different answers possible in that equation. But here's what's going to happen. When the government realizes it can do this and that it will and it gets away with it, they're going to say to themselves, well, we don't have to cut spending.
Right, yeah.
We'll just keep doing this. And you can't keep doing that without tanking the economy in the end.
Right.
In the end, that behavior crashes the economy.
Yeah, you become Venezuela.
And every step you take towards that eventual result is a step you likely can't untake. We're looking at a situation in which we understand what the end of days looks like, and we can kind of predict when it's going to happen, given the behavior of the ruling class. Now, we don't have a prediction yet, but when they start monetizing the debt, we will be able to predict with good clarity when the last day of the United States of America will be.
I hold out hope that some reasonable politicians will come to the fore, as they have throughout our...
Oh, God, do you hear yourself?
But listen, we've been in our 200 plus years of existence in straits as bad as this relative to what we were in the past. And the right people have shown up at the right time. The solution here is to put the federal government on a diet. We've run the numbers on this, and I haven't done it recently, but I imagine that the correct numbers are approximately what I'm going to say, which is cutting the federal budget by 10% across the board and holding it constant for 6 years, maybe 7 years. And then you'll get a balanced budget. And then you can continue to grow the federal government, just don't grow it faster than the economy. But that kind of a thing requires some, we haven't used the word in a long time, statesmen, to kick politics in the teeth and say, this is what we need to do to keep the country together.
Well, we haven't had statesmen for a very long time. And looking forward to the upcoming election, we don't have them yet.
No, I don't think we do. But by the same token, I don't think things have gotten bad enough to bring those people to the fore yet.
You are far, far more sanguine about the possibility of our getting good politicians than I am. If your answer to any question is we need better people, you've already lost. You will not get better people.
Well, at this stage in the game, I'd settle for just not worse people, because that's where we've been going for the past few elections.
Well, then you're in luck, Ant, because we can't get worse people this
The
next
same
election
people.
because we're running the exact same two people. So by definition, it can't get any worse. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.